The desert does not hurry. It keeps its secrets beneath layers of wind and silence. In the late 18th century, when the soldiers of France marched through the Nile Delta, they thought they were chasing glory, not ghosts. Their boots struck dust that had once been cities. Their shovels bit into ground that had listened to the prayers of pharaohs. And yet, amid the ruins of a small fort near a town the locals called Rashid and the Europeans named Rosetta, something ancient waited for them. It began as a glint of black beneath the crumbling wall of Fort Julian. A young officer leaned closer, brushing away sand that clung like memory. What appeared was not gold, nor relic, nor treasure, but a dark slab of stone flecked with lighter veins. At first it looked ordinary, a piece of building debris reused to mend a wall. But as the dust cleared, faint lines revealed themselves, rows of tiny symbols marching across its face. The men knelt, puzzled. 3 sets of writing, each a different hand, each carved with a purpose none of them could name. The soldiers called for their lieutenant, Pierre-François Bouchard, a man trained to see order where others saw chance. He studied the carvings by torchlight. The top line shimmered with the sacred figures of ancient Egypt, the next with quick, flowing marks used by scribes of the people, and the final with letters of Greek, the language of philosophers and conquerors. 3 tongues on one stone, resting together in improbable harmony. Bouchard felt the quiet pull of significance, though he could not yet explain it. He ordered a copy to be made before night fell. Outside, the Nile breathed its steady rhythm, the same river that had carried the stones of the pyramids and the whispers of priests. The men returned to their campfires, but the image of that slab followed them. They did not know that what they had uncovered was more than an inscription. It was a voice caught between ages, the bridge that would one day teach humanity to hear the words of Egypt again. The stone had slept through centuries of silence, through floods and empires and wars, waiting for someone to listen. In the morning, the sun rose over Rosetta, striking the surface until it shone like glass. Dust swirled and settled again. History had stirred, quietly, in the hands of men who thought they were merely rebuilding a wall. The sun hung low over the Nile Delta, blurring the horizon where river met sky. Within the stone walls of Fort Julian, the air smelled of limestone and sweat, and every sound seemed to echo. Soldiers carried baskets of rubble, unaware that history had already chosen its witness among them. The black slab they unearthed lay propped against a wall, half cleaned, half forgotten, but its presence had begun to pull scholars from across the French expedition's ranks. When Lieutenant Pierre-François Bouchard returned to inspect the find, he brought with him members of the Commission of Arts and Sciences, men who had sailed from Europe not to fight, but to study. Their notebooks were already heavy with sketches of temples and measurements of pyramids, yet this stone felt different. It carried words, and words, unlike monuments, could be translated. They washed the slab with water from the Nile, the rivulets catching the carved lines like veins of light. At the top, they saw the ancient symbols of Egypt: falcons, serpents, and suns, each figure drawn with sacred precision. Beneath them ran another script, the quick and slanted writing used for contracts and daily life, what scholars would later call demotic. And below that, clear and familiar to European eyes, was the Greek tongue, the language of administration during the reign of the Ptolemies. The realization came slowly but with growing excitement. If these 3 texts spoke the same decree, then the known could unlock the unknown. They copied the inscriptions by hand as the day burned to gold. Some men murmured that it was nothing, a mere dedication. Others whispered that it was everything, a key waiting to be turned. One scholar, still young and full of hope, wrote in his notes that this stone might reveal the lost voice of the pharaohs. Another smiled and dismissed the idea as a dream, but history would prove that dream true. As dusk fell, the soldiers rested while the scholars argued by lamplight. Outside the fort, the Nile carried its slow procession of boats and songs. Inside, a single torch flickered beside the stone, its flame reflected on the polished surface. None of them could yet imagine how this quiet evening would ripple across centuries, or how this black slab would one day rest in a museum half a world away. For now, it was only a mystery sleeping under the murmurs of men and the hum of the river. The night deepened, and the first stars appeared above Rosetta. The stone waited, patient and silent, as though it knew that its words would one day awaken the ancient heart of Egypt. The story of the stone did not remain within the walls of Fort Julien. Word travelled down the Nile, carried by officers, scholars, and rumour. In Alexandria, the intellectual heart of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, the discovery stirred a quiet storm. The scholars of the Commission of Arts and Sciences crowded around the rough sketches and handwritten copies, their fingers tracing the strange mixture of signs. They sensed that this was not merely a relic of faith or ceremony. It was a message from a forgotten language, a cipher that could bridge centuries of silence. Egypt in those days stood at a crossroads of empire. The French campaign had begun with the thunder of cannon and the promise of conquest, but it had grown into something else, a collision between military ambition and scientific curiosity. Napoleon had brought not only soldiers but also astronomers, geographers, linguists, and engineers. He dreamed of rebuilding Egypt as a modern jewel of enlightenment, illuminated by reason and discovery. Yet beneath that dream lay the ruins of a world far older, one that spoke in a tongue no living person could read. When the Rosetta Stone was found in the late 18th century, hieroglyphs were considered decorative symbols, mystical and unknowable. For over 1,000 years, their true meaning had been lost, their sound extinguished after the rise of Christianity and the closing of the old temples in the 4th century of the Common Era. The priests who once knew their secret had vanished, their scrolls turned to dust, their knowledge unspoken. Generations of scholars had stared at the carved walls of temples and tombs, wondering what messages the ancients had left behind. Now, with the stone in hand, hope returned. If the Greek inscription matched the other two scripts, perhaps the code could be broken. Yet hope has a way of igniting rivalry. When the tides of war turned and French forces faced defeat, the British demanded the artifacts collected by Napoleon's scholars. Among those spoils was the black slab from Rosetta. The French protested, arguing that knowledge belonged to all mankind. The British insisted that victory decided ownership. In the end, the stone was surrendered, carried carefully aboard a ship bound for London. By the time it reached the British Museum in the early 19th century, the Rosetta Stone had already become a legend. People lined up to see it, not for what it said, but for what it promised. In its quiet lines of script lay the possibility of understanding a civilization that had shaped the ancient world. Empires had fought to possess it, but the stone belonged to time itself. It waited again, not in the sand this time, but beneath the vaulted halls of a new empire, ready for another generation to listen. Inside the great hall of the British Museum, the black stone stood under lamplight, its surface glistening with the faint polish of river dust. Scholars crowded around it, their voices echoing softly through the marble chamber. They ran their fingers along its threefold script, tracing each mark as if it were a pulse. What they saw was not only an inscription but a conversation between civilizations. The first line belonged to the sacred tongue of the priests, the second to the daily speech of the people, and the third to the Greek of conquerors. 3 worlds, 1 decree. The Greek text spoke clearly to anyone educated in the classics. It told of a royal edict issued by priests in honor of King Ptolemy V, a young ruler who had ascended the throne in the 2nd century before the Common Era. It listed his acts of generosity, his gifts to temples, his reduction of taxes. It was a statement of loyalty, inscribed for the gods and for the people. But the real treasure was not the message itself. It was the key it offered. The same words, repeated in 3 languages, meant that one might explain the others. Scholars began to copy the inscriptions with painstaking care. They filled notebooks with measurements, drawings, and guesses. Some claimed that the top script, the hieroglyphs, were purely symbolic artistic emblems that represented ideas rather than sounds. Others believed that they might conceal a phonetic code, a way to spell names and titles. The debate stretched across decades, filling journals and drawing rooms with arguments. Among the first to make progress was the English polymath Thomas Young. A physician by profession and a linguist by passion, he examined the cartouches, the oval frames that enclosed royal names, and noticed repeating signs that matched the Greek word for Ptolemy. From this, he deduced that some hieroglyphs must represent specific sounds. It was a small crack in the wall of mystery, but through that crack, light began to enter. Meanwhile, in France, another scholar was quietly preparing to continue the chase. His name was Jean-François Champollion, a child prodigy who had studied the Coptic language, the last surviving descendant of ancient Egyptian speech since his youth. While Europe debated ownership and translation, Champollion listened to the whisper of sounds that had nearly disappeared. He believed that within those whispers lay the living heart of Egypt itself. The Rosetta Stone had crossed borders and seas, yet its true journey was inward, from silence to comprehension. 3 scripts waited for a voice bold enough to hear them together, to weave them back into a single story. The priests of Ptolemy's court had carved their devotion to the king. What they could not have imagined was that centuries later, their words would become the bridge that reconnected the world to their gods. Across Europe, the quiet war for understanding had begun. Scholars wrote by candlelight, sending letters filled with theories that crossed the channel as swiftly as ships could sail. Each believed they were close to unlocking the ancient script. Each guarded their findings like soldiers protecting a secret map. Yet for all their brilliance, no one could yet make the hieroglyphs speak with certainty. They were patterns without breath, symbols without sound. Thomas Young in England had come the closest. By studying the Greek and Demotic lines, he identified names like Ptolemy and Berenice. He proposed that the same sequence of signs might represent those names in hieroglyphs, proving that the system was at least partly phonetic. But he stopped short of believing that the entire language could work that way. To him, hieroglyphs were a hybrid of sound and symbol, a puzzle too vast for one mind alone to master. In France, Jean-François Champollion was quietly transforming that hesitation into conviction. Born in the small town of Figeac in the late 18th century, he had grown up obsessed with Egypt. As a boy, he pored over travelers' sketches of temples and statues, memorizing every strange figure carved into the stone. By the time he reached Paris, he could already read Coptic, the liturgical language of Egyptian Christians, and the final echo of the old tongue. Where others saw pictures, he saw syllables buried in the shapes. He began to suspect that the language of the priests had not vanished entirely, only changed its form. The early 19th century turned into a contest of letters and pride. Reports from the British Museum were studied in Paris. French notes were counted in London. Each new paper built upon the last, a dialogue as fierce as any battle fought on the Nile. But Champollion was relentless. He filled his notebooks with lists of signs, testing each against Coptic roots. He marked the cartouches containing royal names Cleopatra, Alexander, Ramses, and compared them across monuments. Slowly, patterns emerged. Certain signs repeated where particular sounds were expected. What had been mystery became structure. What had been silence began to murmur. By the middle of the 1820s, Champollion felt the pieces aligning. He knew the risk of announcing too soon, but he could not contain his excitement. The Rosetta Stone had opened a door that humanity had not walked through in nearly 15 centuries. And behind that door waited the voices of kings, scribes, and laborers, their words pressed into stone and sealed by time. He did not yet know that his next discovery would push that door wide open. Europe would remember his name not as a scholar who guessed, but as the man who finally listened. The story of discovery often hinges on a single heartbeat. For Jean-François Champollion, that heartbeat arrived one quiet afternoon in Paris in the early 1820s. His desk was buried in papers. each covered with the same looping symbols, the same comparisons between the Coptic he could read and the hieroglyphs that no one could. Days of exhaustion had bled into nights of obsession. He had stopped attending dinners, stopped writing letters, and sometimes even forgot to eat. The Rosetta Stone had become the center of his world, a whisper he could almost understand if only he listened more closely. On that afternoon, he was studying the cartouche of a name. He had compared the symbols for Ptolemy and Cleopatra, noticing shared letters, two reeds, a lion, a folded cloth. The logic of sound took shape in his mind. If each symbol represented not a divine idea, but a phonetic sound, then the language could be read, not merely interpreted. Hieroglyphs were not silent pictures. They were letters, living and breathing as words. Champollion stood, overwhelmed by the realization. Witnesses later said he ran from his study, shouting for his brother. He burst through the door of his brother's office, exclaiming, "I have it." Then, overcome by emotion and exhaustion, he collapsed to the floor. For a moment, the long silence of Egypt seemed to end in the sound of one man's discovery. When he awoke, his notes were spread across the room, his ink smudged where his hand had fallen, but his mind was clear. He began to write the paper that would change history. The hieroglyphic system, he explained, was a mixture of phonetic and symbolic signs. It recorded the ancient Egyptian language, preserved across centuries in the Coptic tongue. The connection was complete. The code was broken. News of his announcement reached across Europe. In lecture halls, students whispered his name with reverence. In England, Thomas Young read the paper with a mixture of admiration and regret. The race was over. The mystery had yielded its truth. The Rosetta Stone, born of conquest and accident, had spoken again. Champollion's breakthrough did more than restore a lost language. It resurrected a civilization. For the first time in nearly 1,500 years, the words carved on temple walls, tombs, and statues could be understood. Ancient Egypt began to speak to the modern world, not as myth, but as memory. That night, as candles flickered across his desk, Champollion copied the names of kings and queens from old inscriptions. He whispered them aloud, their sounds awkward in his modern tongue. Yet even in that dim room in Paris, the air seemed to change, as if the Nile itself had exhaled after a long sleep. The past was no longer silent. It was alive again. When the dust of discovery settled, the world found itself standing before a new horizon. The Rosetta Stone, once a mere artifact of empire, had become the bridge between the living and the long dead. Through Champollion's insight, the tombs of Egypt opened not with crowbars and chisels, but with words. The ancient inscriptions that once lined the walls of temples and pyramids, dismissed for centuries as mystic decoration, now revealed their stories in sentences that any patient scholar could read. In the decades that followed, explorers returned to Egypt armed not with weapons but with notebooks and ink. They entered the Valley of the Kings, the halls of Karnak, the colonnades of Luxor, tracing each carved line by lantern light. What they found was a civilization more human than legend had ever allowed. The kings spoke of grain and taxes as much as they spoke of gods. The artisans left notes about deliveries of paint and stone. The priests recorded prayers that trembled between duty and devotion. A chorus of everyday life rose from the sand, soft but unbroken, like a river rediscovered beneath desert soil. Through the deciphered texts, the people of ancient Egypt stepped out of the haze of myth and into the texture of reality. We learned their names, their fears, their humor, even their complaints. The grand pyramids were no longer silent monuments, but archives of lives lived under the same sun we know today. A line from a tomb might read, "May my son remember me," and suddenly the gulf of centuries closed. Champollion continued his work tirelessly, cataloguing signs and phonetic systems, translating royal lists, and mapping the grammar of a tongue that had been asleep since the 4th century of the Common Era. When he traveled to Egypt later in life, he walked through temples he had only seen in books. Standing before the walls of Abu Simbel, He read aloud the names of Ramses and Nefertari, the very same names carved by artisans 3,000 years before. The echo that returned was not just his own voice. It was history acknowledging that it had been heard. The Rosetta Stone had done more than restore a language. It had resurrected identity. Through it, the people of Egypt spoke again, not through kings alone, but through scribes, farmers, and children whose words had once vanished into the dust. The mystery had not merely been solved, it had been redeemed. The 19th century unfolded like a dawn over Egypt. What had once been mute ruins now filled journals, museums, and lecture halls with the hum of rediscovery. The Rosetta Stone became both relic and revelation, a symbol of how knowledge survives in fragments, waiting for the right question to wake it. Each expedition that followed carried Champollion's grammar in its satchel, and each inscription copied from the temple walls returned as a word reborn. By the middle of the century, Egyptology had emerged as a new science, and Europe looked toward the Nile as if seeing it for the first time. Travelers brought back papyri rolled tight as scrolls of smoke. Scholars compared the language of the priests with Coptic hymns still sung in the monasteries of Upper Egypt. Even the simplest offering bowls and clay shards were read as documents of belief and habit. The dead spoke, not through ghosts, but through the clarity of grammar. Inside the British Museum, the Rosetta Stone stood under a glass case, its surface rubbed smooth by centuries of dust and handling. Visitors came to stare, to imagine the moment when symbols turned into words. They did not always understand the details, but they felt the weight of the connection, that all civilizations, no matter how distant, crave to be understood. In that hall, amid whispers in English, French, and Arabic, 3 languages once carved for a boy king seemed to sing together again. The scholars who followed Champollion built upon his foundation. They traced the history of Egypt back beyond the pyramids, through dynasties that had ruled before the time of Moses and beyond. The temples of Thebes and Abydos gave up their prayers. The tomb of Seti, the first, yielded its ceiling of stars. What the Rosetta Stone had opened became an unending dialogue between the ancient and the modern. And yet, beneath all the academic triumph, there was a quieter lesson. The stone had shown that conquest can reveal as much as it destroys, that curiosity can redeem what ambition claims. Napoleon's soldiers had found it while repairing a wall, unaware that they were unearthing the heart of a civilization. Empires had fought over its possession, but its true power was never in ownership. It was in translation, in the act of listening. As the century turned, the Rosetta Stone remained in London, encased in glass, visited by millions, yet still belonging to the silence from which it had come. The real inheritance it offered was not a language, but a truth, that even across the vast deserts of time, understanding is possible when we dare to learn how to hear. Time has its own kind of patience. More than 2 centuries after its rediscovery, the Rosetta Stone still stands beneath the vaulted ceiling of the British Museum, quietly commanding the same awe that once filled the soldiers at Rosetta. Visitors line before it in reverent silence. Some see only a dark, uneven rock, its carvings worn and cracked by the centuries. Others see what it truly is, a conversation between worlds that refuse to forget one another. Each generation has brought new ways of listening. In the 20th century, photography and infrared imaging revealed faint lines invisible to the naked eye. Scholars traced every mark until even the smallest nick became part of the story. Later, computers compared the stone's text with hundreds of other inscriptions, building vast digital lexicons of the ancient language. And now, in the 21st century, 3-dimensional scans and virtual reconstructions allow anyone, anywhere, to examine the same surface once touched by the priests of Ptolemy and the hands of French soldiers. The language that once slept beneath sand now travels across glass screens and fiber optic lines, alive again in every corner of the world. Yet for all our technology, the wonder remains the same. We still stand before the Rosetta Stone and feel the hum of recognition the moment when human minds, separated by millennia, meet across the bridge of words. Through it we glimpse the rhythm of ancient lives, a priest composing a hymn for the Temple of Memphis, a scribe recording harvest yields, a mason carving names with steady hands in the heat of the Egyptian Sunday. Their tasks were simple, their intentions humble, yet their traces became the very map by which we found them again. The stone's endurance has also become a question of belonging. Egypt has asked for its return, seeing in it not only an artifact of knowledge but a fragment of identity taken during an age of empire. The British Museum has declined, arguing that the stone belongs to the heritage of all humankind. Perhaps both are true. The Rosetta Stone is Egyptian by birth, European by history, and universal by meaning. It speaks for every culture that has ever feared being forgotten. When we look at it now, beneath the soft museum lights, we do not simply read, we remember. The men who found it, the minds who deciphered it, and the voices who carved it all merge into one quiet chorus. The same sentence written in 3 scripts still whispers the same truth that language is not bound by time, and that silence, however long it lasts, is never the end of the story. There are moments in human history when discovery feels less like invention and more like remembrance. The Rosetta Stone stands as one of those moments. It is a relic that transcends its material form, a bridge between centuries that refuse to remain broken. Inside its carvings are not only the words of priests or decrees of kings, but the proof that memory itself can survive catastrophe. The language of Egypt, once thought forever lost after the temples closed in the 4th century of the Common Era, breathes again because a handful of men refused to stop listening. When Champollion's translations spread through Europe, they opened the floodgates of Egypt's past. Within a few decades, explorers uncovered tombs untouched since antiquity. Inscriptions once regarded as decoration turned into archives of daily life. The walls of Karnak, Luxor, and Edfu became pages in an endless book, each symbol a syllable in the vast story of civilization. What began with a single stone evolved into a dialogue spanning continents and ages. The Rosetta Stone had not only given us a way to read Egypt, it had reminded us how knowledge itself travels through time. Today, that conversation continues in classrooms, museums, and research centers around the world. Students trace the same hieroglyphs that once puzzled the scholars of the 18th century. Historians revisit Champollion's notes and find new meaning in his meticulous lines. The Rosetta Stone endures as more than a tool. It is a testament to the persistence of curiosity, the spark that pushes humanity to listen to the whispers of the earth. For the people of modern Egypt, it remains a heartbeat of identity. Each letter recovered from the sand is a return, each translated line a resurrection. When Egyptian archaeologists stand before the temples of their ancestors and read aloud the ancient prayers, the circle closes. The voices once buried beneath empire and time now speak again through their descendants. And so the stone remains, both in London and in the minds of all who study it. It reminds us that translation is not only the act of turning words from one language to another, but of turning silence into sound, distance into connection, and loss into memory. Beneath its glass case, the light glints across the surface like ripples on the Nile, and one can almost believe the carvings move as they catch the glow. The priests who inscribed those lines could never have imagined this afterlife, yet their words endure. The conversation they began 2 millennia ago has never truly ended. It lives in every whisper of discovery, in every language learned, and in every moment humanity chooses to listen. The museum grows quiet after closing, its halls emptied of footsteps and chatter. In the dim light, the Rosetta Stone stands alone, surrounded by the faint hum of air and the weight of time. The glass above it reflects more than faces. It mirrors the entire lineage of curiosity that has passed before it, the soldiers who uncovered it by accident, the scholars who lost sleep chasing its meaning. the countless visitors who have leaned close just to feel its presence. The stone does not speak aloud, yet in its silence there is language, and in its stillness there is movement. Outside, rain slides across the streets of London like the slow pulse of the Nile. Inside, light shimmers over the carved lines where three worlds once met: the priests of Memphis, the scribes of Alexandria, and the philosophers of Greece. Their voices overlap still, a quiet harmony that defies centuries. Every mark carries the memory of hands that believed in permanence. Every letter is a seed of thought that refused to die. To look at the Rosetta Stone is to see the impossible understanding born from ruin. It reminds us that language is the breath of civilization, that to decipher is to resurrect, and that even the most broken fragment can teach us how to listen again. The soldiers who found it could not have guessed that their discovery would outlast every empire they served. Yet the stone remains, unchanged, whispering the same truth to anyone willing to pause long enough to hear it. Somewhere beyond the glass, life continues, fast and forgetful. But here, time slows until past and present fold into one. The Rosetta Stone stands not as a monument to conquest, but to connection. It belongs to no single nation, for it speaks to all who have ever feared being forgotten. In its ancient carvings, humanity recognizes itself endlessly searching, endlessly translating, endlessly remembering.